what are sort of the first words that spring to mind when you think of somebody who's high on the HDS Mischievous Scale? Risky? Manipulative? Fun? Impulsive? Smooth? Yeah. Possibly charming. Indeed, indeed. So you can see there are all of those adjectives could apply to somebody who's high on mischievous. So it is quite a broad range, quite a broad, compared to something like bold, which I think is kind of much more straightforward. When I was putting this presentation together, I thought, well, what are the things that occur to me? And they're very similar to what's come up here, apart from maybe the last one, actually. Maybe that didn't come up, although fun kind of fits into that when it's being positive. So yeah, the manipulative piece brings together the themes of charm, persuasion, influence, but also using or exploiting people. Risk-taking, that came up. The impulsivity piece, the limit testing, being easily bored as well, I think, is part of mischievous, that restless quality. And then nonconformist. So yes, these people can seem very fun, but part of that is, oh, I'm going to do it my way. Oh, I don't have to do it like everybody else. I don't have to follow those rules, which can feed into actually, being so nonconformist that they're quite happy to be deceitful as well. But you can see how those things, there are themes there, they overlap, they kind of shape shift. Being deceitful is also about risk-taking as well. That's our kind of starting point. Also the name. So similar to leisurely, I know leisurely is kind of even worse because leisurely isn't a word that we use in the UK. We do use the word mischievous in the UK, but we tend to think of it, I don't know, it's almost, for me, it sort of brings up images of children for some reason, being a little bit naughty. So in a business context, there's always maybe a slight hesitation about using that name, maybe a slight discomfort for the person actually delivering the feedback. And in fact, I look back at I've got a fax between myself and Bob Hogan from 1998. And those were the two names that I raised even then, leisurely and mischievous. I discussed with Bob even then as being an issue. And at that point, he suggested procrastinating instead for leisurely and risk-taking for mischievous. I think adventurous is also a theme that comes up when I'm going to start to refer to some of the writings of Alderman Morris that I touched on last time. They call this the normal range of this personality disorder, which is the sort of mischievous. They call it adventurous. So those are kind of maybe some other names that you could possibly use if you didn't want to use mischievous. So what do we already know about this scale? What's our starting position? What are the kinds of words and phrases that we use that come up from our training courses, in our reports, and in our manuals? So the standard definition is that the HDS Mischievous Scale reflects the degree to which a person seems charming, risk-taking, and excitement-seeking. And that the result of that is that maybe they have trouble maintaining commitments and learning from experience. And all of that is true, but there's a lot more to it, I feel, than that. In terms of high scorers and why they're difficult to work with, yet they tend to test the limits of people who are not high mischievous. That can be deeply uncomfortable to be around. They ignore their mistakes because they don't worry about it. They're not going to dwell on their mistakes, so they just move on and they take risks that they're comfortable with, but others might feel are very ill-advised. But at their best, they've got all these positive things. They're charming, spontaneous, fun-loving, exciting. And yeah, they can be flexible. They can adapt quickly to change, maybe even embrace it because of that kind of bored, restless quality. It's like, oh, what's new? Oh, yes, let's go and do that kind of quality. And people enjoy being with them because of that. Those can be some very attractive qualities when they're being used in their effective zone. So the positives, there's lots of positives, and these are some of the reasons why it's difficult sometimes to give feedback to people who are high on mischievous. Yeah, they can be described as being interesting, fun, attractive company. They can work a crowd, they can be persuasive and influential, they can sell a vision, persuade, be spontaneous, be daring. And they'll have had a lot of positive feedback for that, and people will like spending time with them because of that and be drawn to them because of those qualities. But on the downside, as we know, then they've got that restless quality, always moving on to the next thing, which can be very draining after a while, once you see that as being a regular pattern of behaviour. Just being impulsive, just acting absolutely on the spur of the moment. Again, for those who are less impulsive, that can be very uncomfortable. Taking risks that others really feel unhappy with. No remorse, not even sort of, maybe sort of thinking, oh, I shouldn't have done that, or feeling sorry about it. The lack of regret. And all of that feeds into being able to make the same mistakes again. White lies, which we'll come back to, not learning then from your mistakes because you're not dwelling on what went wrong, assuming that rules aren't for them. I'm above that. That's not for me. And manipulative. So similarly to the leisurely scale, where I looked for more vocabulary and more descriptors was in the workings of clinical psychologists who have looked at the personality disorder framework, which the HDS is based on the taxonomy of personality disorders, but pegged back to the normal range. And there are a couple of writers in this area. There's Alderman Morris, who I'll come back to again in a moment, but also somebody called Theodore Millon as well, who's written a lot in this area. And I'd say what they add, it's not that they're necessarily telling us anything wonderfully new and different, but you'll see they add a richness to the vocabulary. If you're looking ever for other sources of information to describe the mischievous person, then the writings around normal range antisocial personality disorder, as this one is, can be the key to that. So as I say, HDS taxonomy based on the personality disorder framework, but obviously it isn't assessing personality disorders. But in that framework, then the mischievous scale relates to what's called the antisocial personality disorder. So when we have a look at how, so to give you the sort of starting point that the mischievous isn't, this is the definition of somebody who would actually have the antisocial personality disorder. So this is a bit more extreme. So it would be a pervasive pattern of disregard for and violation of the rights of others, as indicated by 3 or more of the following. Failure to conform to social norms with respect to lawful behaviours, deceitfulness, as indicated by repeated lying, use of aliases, or conning others for personal profit or pleasure, impulsivity or failure to plan ahead, irritability and aggressiveness. I was a bit interested in this one. I'm not aware of this really in relation to mischievous, as indicated by repeated physical fights or assault, reckless disregard for safety of self or others, consistent irresponsibility, as indicated by repeated failure to sustain consistent work behaviour or honour financial obligations, and lack of remorse, as indicated by being indifferent to or rationalising having hurt, mistreated or stolen from another. Okay, so that is the personality disorder. So that is very extreme, and that isn't what we're talking about with mischievous, but there are themes there. There are aspects of that if you take it back a step or two. So the first one even, you can recast that within organisational norms or societal norms. So it's failure to conform to the organisation's norms with respect to what are the rules, the policies, procedures. You could absolutely substitute that there. Deceitfulness, yes, certainly telling a few white lies. Impulsivity, absolutely. Not sure about number 4. I haven't come across that really, I would say. The reckless disregard for safety. So I often talk about how mischievous people doing things like, driving fast cars and things like that, and their degree of comfort with that. They're quite happy to take that risk. Irresponsibility, and just, it's almost like, well, I was going to say it's a bit like they're not a grown-up, really, but that's maybe going a bit far. But I guess, you think of Boris Johnson has to be an example of this in terms of the the notion of, normal rules don't apply, and I'm just going to behave the way that I want to. So I would say there is a bit of that in there. And then in terms of so that's the extreme personality disorder definition. So let's bring it back to, well, what descriptors have we got from Millon and from Oldham and Morris around the antisocial personality disorder that might be useful to us? So Theodore Millon, actually, I just love the way that he writes, and he writes a lot. But anyway, if we just take his take on the normal range antisocial personality disorder, he says these are individuals they're often rewarded by our competitive society. If you go back to those positive features that I described for mischievous, you can see immediately how those will relate to people's success in certain types of jobs, not all, obviously. Where the ability to act tough and bend the rules is admired. It is admired in many situations as necessary for success and survival in a dog-eat-dog world. So in those very competitive kinds of worlds, in corporate worlds, that is, these are styles of behavior that are often rewarded. And then he says, so I'm just smiling because of the kind of language he uses, between the extremes of normal adjustment and the most brutal abuse of human life, that's the personality disorder, lie many shades of grey. Some antisocials jealously guard their autonomy, striking preemptively or at anyone who might restrict or condemn their behaviour. In contrast, although normal variants, so this would be people who score high on mischievous, do sometimes impulsively transgress social standards. Most do find a place for themselves, as we know, in the rugged side of business, military or political life. He also describes some of the adaptive traits of this more normal style of the antisocial type. And his descriptors here are about having this capacity for self-sufficiency. These are people who will do their own thing. They don't need your approval. They probably are quite ambitious. They may well be quite competitive. And when they're in their effective zone, they have this constructive pursuit of individuality and self-determination, doing it their way. And finally, from Millon, he also has a variant of the normal range that he calls the dissenting personality, which brings in a few more themes. So this is vocabulary that you can add to the standard vocabulary that we have around HDS. So yes, being unconventional, I talked about being nonconformist, doing things their own way, willing to take consequences. They're comfortable with that, regardless of how others might judge them. Inclined to finesse the truth, so that's a nice way of talking about the white lies. So, and I love this, sometimes flirt with legal boundaries in pursuit of their own goals and desires. That's a nice phrase to have in your back pocket. Don't want to accept customary responsibilities. It's just boring and tedious and dull for them. They see themselves as independent or perhaps creatively autonomous. They don't have much time for authority. I tend to view it with contempt. Dislike the boring, the mundane, the daily routine. They are much more impulsive and perhaps irresponsible. They will stretch as far as they can the limit of social standards or organizational standards. But they will, they have that sort of self-determination. There is a sort of positive action-oriented side, of course, to mischievous. So they will push forward. They will overturn obstacles with perhaps, clever thinking, clever maneuvers, or perhaps their slightly intimidating posture when they're being perhaps a bit too overbearing. And they will seize the initiative. They'll get stuff done to make matters work, but to their own ends, for their own purpose, for their own agenda, to pursue their own desires. So those are all I thought, some really great descriptors from Millon. But then coming back now to Oldham and Morris, who I referenced in the previous talk on Leisurely and their book, The New Personality Self-Portrait. So they call the normal range antisocial personality disorder the adventurous style. And they say that this style can be captured by these following 8 characteristics. So this is quite a nice way of kind of summarizing all the different aspects and themes within being high on mischievous, I think. So you've got your non-conformity piece, having your own internal code of what you want to do and what you think is okay. Challenge, yeah, you know, and just wanting to do things differently. To live is to dare. They've got that excitement-seeking, thrill-seeking piece to them. So they might do a lot of high-risk activities as well. Mutual independence, kind of, you know, just worry about yourself and I'll worry about me sort of feeling. They don't worry too much about others. They expect us all to be responsible for ourselves. Persuasiveness, we all know this piece, that sort of persuasive, influential style, being silver-tongued and very gifted in influencing people. Wanderlust, the restless quality, like to keep moving, happy to move on from one job to another, one position to another, one location to another. You know, very happy. They don't worry about finding work. They expect to live on their wits, really, live well by their own talent and skills, expect to find something. Wild oats is the one here. In childhood and adolescence, perhaps the adventurous personality style might have been fairly high-spirited. It's a potential avenue for discussion. True grit, I guess this goes with the risk-taking piece. You know, they can be very courageous, even physically bold and tough, and they'll stand up to people who dare to challenge them. They don't have, so they have that degree of comfort, I think, in conflict situations that others who are lower on mischievous don't. And no regrets. We've touched on this theme quite a few times now. Living in the present, not worrying about what went before. Life is all about the here and now. So I think there's some great vocabulary that we can use here. But how do these things then manifest at work? Have we got any additional information from these writers that might help us to make sense of how somebody who's high on mischievous behaves at work? Anything new here to say? Well, Oldham and Morris would say that these people, they like to be faced with challenges. So they might do things that are quite extreme, like, you know, being a fighter pilot or a stunt person. But for any of them, whether they're a corporate lawyer or whether they're a stunt person, they might well try to bend or break the rules for expediency, or if they don't think they make sense. You know, if they don't make sense to them. But they can be very, very successful people and build their own commercial empires. You know, they might be wheeling and dealing, bending rules, where they can find a nice sort of happy place to do that, where they can find a flexible spot to do that. So yeah, I think they have an unusual degree of comfort in conflict situations or where there's disagreement, really comfortable in doing their own thing, going their own way. So to go through the kind of points that Oldham and Morris have, life is one big opportunity to do what they please. At work, they're slaves of no system. They've got to be faced with a challenge, otherwise they're going to get really easily bored. They want new projects, they want excitement in their work. Depending on other aspects of their personality, though, if they've got things that are a bit more disciplined, then some of that can feed into more conventional roles, but there's still a kind of a risk element. So being a heart surgeon or being a criminal lawyer, probably more like a barrister than a solicitor, though, then they've got that performative element to it as well. Obviously, they can be good talkers, so in a workplace, you can see how that can be used to their advantage if they're in a role where they need to persuade and influence people. They're probably more likely to be entrepreneurs than managers because they resist authority, don't have much truck with it, not really great planners. That's not their number one priority. Really hate tedious and boring follow through and don't accept responsibility for others. You know, you've got to get on with it yourself. Then being a manager is not a great fit for somebody who's high on mischievous, depending on the rest of their personality, I guess, as well. But in any kind of job, they're going to be easily bored unless they're always being challenged with something new and interesting. They will carve out their own opportunities at work. They don't rely on others for that. And they have their own inner sense of right and wrong. You might not agree with it, and society in general might not even agree with it. They don't necessarily buy the official version or feel any compunction to do that. And they don't worry about being in conflict with that either. And in terms of management style, then, it probably somebody who's like really high on mischievous, it's probably rare to find them in a traditional management role. They might be working in more creative, non-traditional environments if they're being a manager. But they could well be a leader. It's just being a manager, a day-to-day manager of people isn't really a great fit. So as a leader, you know, they could have that vision, they might have brilliant ideas, they might have the charm and the magnetism to attract others to join in their excitement, at least for a period of time. So yeah, they've got the style and charisma, but in terms of being an effective people manager, that's not really going to be a great fit for them. And also because they get easily bored, you know, once everything's up and running, then they'll want to move on to the next thing rather than checking in with people. If they're okay, what do they need to develop to the next stage? They're not really going to be interested in that. And in terms, and you might have, I know I've referenced this quote before, but I wanted to give you an example of somebody that I have fed back to who was high on mischievous that I thought really, and obviously they were quite extreme, encapsulates what a high mischievous person feels very comfortable even revealing about themselves. So this person said, I keep my superiors happy so I can get on with what I want to do. I'm not afraid to make mistakes, and I put myself in uncomfortable situations because I want to. It gives me energy. So there you've got themes of manipulation on point 1. You've got no remorse, no learning from past experiences in point 2. And you've got that thrill-seeking, restless, impulsive, excitement-seeking quality in point 3. So yeah, this is how these people come across and how they, you know, what they think is normal and acceptable. So in terms of coaching those people, working with those people, dealing with those people, for you, if you were coaching somebody who's high on the mischievous scale, what is that relationship going to be like? How do mischievous individuals approach the coaching process? And what might that mean for you as a coach? What might you need to do to consider about your style? What might you need to adapt? Well, mischievous individuals, they might be suspicious of a coach, not in the sense of like a skeptical mistrust kind of a thing, but it's more they might think, oh, the coach is trying to sort of constrain me, so that maybe they're trying to make me follow some rules that I just don't agree with, that I don't think are important. So there could be an element of that. They could also be lovely and charming, but actually, and sound like maybe they're on board, but actually underneath it all are actually rejecting the ideas or suggestions or development strategies that maybe you're working on together. And they'll certainly want to underplay the importance or criticality of any of their past mistakes. So it's a difficult role for the coach. It's around being assertive in the nicest possible way, of course, in terms of identifying areas of concern. And you know, sometimes these things don't always work out. You know, that there may be a point where you actually, as a coach, you know, can't get around it. But if you can try to be assertive and firm in the sense of saying, you know, but you are high on this scale, and people who score high on this scale are typically described as this. So it is likely that some of these things are going to be an issue for you. And also, though, in terms of trying to hold them to account a bit when they're minimizing things like their past mistakes, trying to get them to view that through another lens so they can start to see actually how important that was to other people. So recasting, reframing, so that they can start to see it from somebody else's eyes. Because I think and we'll go on to strategies for that in a moment, I think it's just too easy. Some of these people can be so charming that you go, oh, yes, yes, yes. You know, so it's about not giving into the charm offensive, I guess, and remembering what the agenda is, and thinking, you know, the only way you ought to think, well, how am I going to assist this person? How am I going to develop this person? If I simply kind of backtrack and agree with everything that they say and accept that none of this is an issue for them, then nothing's changed. There's no point in my having this discussion with this person. So it's that sort of having that strength of character as a coach, almost, to stand your ground, as I say, in the nicest possible way. Our position is not to judge, and it's not to force anybody to do anything, but it's also not to be completely bowled over by the charm of a high mischievous person. So the coach needs to try to find a way to help the individual start to recognise the career-limiting impact of their behaviours. If there's a way of coming up with examples, or maybe it's through a 360, or some kind of feedback that you can get from colleagues for the high mischievous person, where they can start to see, okay, so this is how this is making this person feel, or this is eroding my credibility. They don't, you know, if you can have some actual examples like that, then that can really help you to encourage the mischievous person to take their feedback seriously. Also, I've referenced again this book, The Coaching the Dark Side of Personality. I've got some examples of questions you could ask somebody who's high on mischievous. So to evaluate their need for change, you could ask them things like, do you break rules just because you think they're boring or unnecessary, or you think they're just suggestions, they're not actually rules? Do you prefer to ask for forgiveness than permission? Do you make decisions that are sometimes risky? Do you act impulsively without thinking about the consequences? Do you feel like you use your charm to get things done? Do you speak your mind or say things to be provocative or amuse yourself without any real objective in mind? I think that's something that high mischievous people, especially when they're bored, are very prone to do. And then you can have some more thought-provoking questions to follow up on that, to say, well, what are the triggers for you to test the limits? When is it you feel yourself kind of slipping into that style of behaviour? Or when is it that you're more likely to make a provocative statement? When has a risk worked well for you? Or when did an impulsive choice actually not turn out so well? What might you have done differently? I quite like this one. How would you describe the risk tolerance of your organisation, and how does that align with yours? Is there a mismatch here? Is there a point at which you need to adapt, or is that mismatch actually working for you and the organisation? Is it something you can leverage? And how might your credibility change if you enlisted others in arriving at a course of action, rather than just saying, all right, I'm going to do this, and everybody's, oh. So in terms of the coaching focus, quite apart from specific strategies, it's important to consider what the overall focus of the coaching should be for a high mischievous person. Remember, these mischievous people, they're often quite selfish, self-centered. They see others as tools to be used, hence they can manipulate and exploit. They've got that low tolerance for boredom, want to move on to something new. So the focus of the coaching is, you know, you're not going to be able to eliminate those potentially derailing characteristics, but try to work with the individuals to see, well, how could we reduce these to a level that makes them more effective, makes them productive, and makes them behave in a way that is actually sanctioned and acceptable within their particular work situation. And we reference a crossing the line exercise, and we use this quite a lot in our own work. This can be very useful here in terms of trying to explain to the high mischievous person what is it we're talking about, because they'll say, but I do this and I do that, and it's great and it's wonderful and it's really effective and it's worked for me, so fine. So, but if you look at some of those characteristics, you can think, okay, so you can be charming, and you can be clever, you can be insightful and come up with a great idea or a great solution. And you can use that charm and personal cleverness in an effective way to achieve a specific goal for you and the organisation and your team. But you can also use it sometimes when you cross the line just for yourself, for your own selfish gain, to advance your own personal agenda. So think about that. Think about how often do you tip over into that style of behaviour? How often do you use the characteristic in that way? And start to think about the impact on other people and how that makes you, how you're perceived when you do that. Or another aspect of mischievous would be making those provocative, off-the-cuff kind of statements. Well, yeah, in an effective zone area, that could really encourage debate and new ideas, spark a different discussion, completely reframe a discussion. Yeah, that's great, but sometimes maybe do you ever tip over into you're just doing it because you're bored, and then it actually isn't serving any objective other than your own personal amusement. Imagine when you do that, imagine when you've done it a few times and people see it, they see it as a consistent pattern of behaviour, and then they start to see you only on this side of the line. They don't see you on the left-hand side of the line. So those are ways of trying to bring to the high mischievous person's attention what are the downsides of crossing that line, and thinking about the potential counterproductive impact of being high or mischievous. So just to finish up with some ideas of coaching strategies that are in the book. One would be, it's all about kind of trying to get them to see the world from another point of view, not just their own. So taking an idea maybe that they've had or a proposal, and analyse the pros and cons, firstly from your perspective, but then somebody else who you work with that you know quite well, but you know their style is very different. Think about it. How would they analyse this information? What would they think were the pros and cons? If they'll admit to a mistake, try to get them to evaluate it, particularly in terms of, well, what happened afterwards? And is there anything they could have done differently where they could actually have engaged others, perhaps a bit more, made that a more trust-building opportunity? And again, yeah, what do you think is great about being high mischievous? But then think about one of your colleagues who isn't high mischievous. How might they view some of those behaviours? And this isn't a strategy as such, but it's a kind of a theme to have in the background that, and this would apply for any coaching around any of the derailers. Just recognizing that our own success in most situations, obviously there'll be some jobs I know that are different and you just are doing your own thing, but in most jobs it's a social situation, and our career success does depend on the support of others. And remembering, trying to find some ways of having strategies where you make sure that you consider ideas from other people's point of view, not just your own. Make sure that you do follow through on your commitments, and that will really get you some brownie points towards how people view your loyalty to them. So see if that's something you could start to work on to improve. And is there some kind of strategy, some kind of mnemonic, or some kind of aid that you could implement that helps you to have a pause before you just act impulsively on what you want to do or what you think is the best decision? And maybe one way of doing that would be to work with the high mischievous person, creating a process of a decision tree. So they actually do have to stop and think about, well, if I do this and this, and they follow various routes of action, just to slow them down a little bit, maybe. And maybe also role play how to accept negative feedback and learn from it. Because with the high mischievous person will usually, they might smile at you and look like they're engaging, but they'll either go away and forget about it, or they might also have some charming words to say, yes, I used to do that, but I don't anymore, or I already have strategies in place to manage that, and I've had really good feedback that I am, and so on. Those kinds of ways of dealing with that kind of feedback is the kind of thing that a high mischievous person often says. So in a coaching situation, you could maybe try to just focus on that and talk them through how actually having negative constructive feedback can be really useful, and give them ways in which they actually, it's almost ways in which they're going to process that information. You give them another way of thinking about it and viewing that information, so that they actually stop a moment and maybe open themselves up to that. So these are the references that I have quoted. Thank you very much.